Once the slaves reached the plantations, they lived in cabins like these beside the main house. Here, many words that came into Gullah from African languages have found their way into standard English. Words such as banana, which comes from the Wolof language spoken in Senegal, and voodoo, traceable to an African word for spirit in the language spoken by the Yoruba people. Other African words which have entered standard English include the animals, zebra, gorilla and chimpanzee, the musical terms samba, mambo, banjo and bongo, and the food and plant names guba, meaning peanut, yam and gumbo, meaning okra. African compound words were translated, giving English terms like badmouse. And nitty-gritty originated as a term for the grit that accumulated in the bilges of slave ships. As well as vocabulary, Gullah employs some grammatical features that differ from standard English.
If someone say, "Honor going for do that," I be done do them. Okay? So they're asking, are you going to do it? I already did it. And I did it a long time ago, essentially, is what you're saying. I be done do them. I done do that, you see? So if you hear somebody say, I done do that, that means they did it and they did it a long time ago, and why are you asking me it? Oh, again, basically. So it's a lot more going into it. So if someone said, well, Hunter going over there, Hunter done yet, they say you're going over there. I be done yet of that, but it done do that too. But I been going there, but it ain't be did it. Why Hunter ain't be did it? When I be did it, Hunter ain't be did it. You see? So it's like, well, you were going over there, yeah, I already went there. But when I went, you weren't there. But I was there. But you're right, I wasn't there when you were there.
Phrases like these have a rich and economical expressiveness. In other ways, Gullah and other Black Englishes have stripped down their grammar. They drop verbs like is, use don't where standard English says doesn't, and omit the apostrophe and s that standard English uses as a sign of ownership. This kind of simplification is common when languages meet and emerge as a new hybrid. It's exactly what happened when Saxons and Danes dealt with each other in England in the 9th century and changed English grammar forever. But in this case, the changes were mistakenly taken by many white observers as evidence that black speakers just hadn't got the intelligence to speak the language properly, that they were simply trying and failing to copy white speech. In fact, they were adding to the language.
Now listen, yeah, you know, some people say they're your friend and thing, but they ain't always your friend. Like that bird rabbit, that boy know he ain't nothing to him. You hear what I say? That cutter was slow motion, and that bird rabbit just as slick as him wanna beat.
But black speakers had their own tradition of performances that showed just how flexible and expressive their language was. They told stories, and they're still told today.
And now Hong Tong come, and oh, I tell you, Brer Rabbit, he'll take off and lickety split.
Brer Rabbit is a direct descendant of animal tricksters who feature in African folklore.
I say, Brer Rabbit, you to tell the truth about Cutter? He said, yes, sir, ma'am. I say, you lie, ting, ain't no truth in you. Ain't no truth in you, no way.
But folktales weren't the only thing that fueled dreams of freedom. With English, the slaves had learned Christianity. White society thought it would teach obedience. The Bible became as central to the lives of the slaves as it had been to the first settlers in New England. But the message they found in it wasn't obedience, it was liberty. Once again, the Bible in English became the book of freedom.
Yeah, Jesus calling. All I want for God. Yeah, Jesus calling. All I want for God. And he's calling for the sinner. All I want for God. Yeah. Oh, children, una back for get ready. Jesus be coming back. Una want for God.
By the first decade of the 19th century, the American states in the North had abolished slavery. When the blacks of the South sang "Steal Away" or "One More River to Cross" or "Bound for Canaan Land," they were introducing new words and sounds into the language, and they were also singing not just about the next world, but about this one, about the hope of escaping to the North and to freedom. The chains of slavery were rusting, and on the 12th of April 1861, in the early hours of the morning, shots were fired at Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor, just behind me. This was the start of the American Civil War, which the North, of course, was to win. 4 years later, Confederate forces abandoned Charleston. The Union Army marched in unopposed. They freed the slaves.
Glory, glory,
yes, in the language of their spirituals had come good for the black people of Charleston.
Glory, glory.
The American Civil War gave us the phrase, hold the fort. And the first people to hear anything on the grapevine were in the southern states, where army telegraph lines strung in the trees became so knotted that they were said to look like grapevines.
Oh, you got to ask the Lord's forgiveness.
There was plenty of resistance to the new order. The Ku Klux Klan, who apparently derived their name from the Greek word kuklos, meaning circle, were formed in the aftermath of the war. They gave English the word bulldozer, originally a bull dose, meaning a dose large enough for a bull. It was a dose of whipping, and it was administered to black people, often fatally. Words like bulldoze are a savage reminder that the end of the war didn't bring the end of segregation and prejudice. In theory, blacks and their language were now free to mix with whites, but in practice, it was only in the 20th century that the mixing of vocabularies really began, that, just like in the plantation houses, white speakers started to ape black speech, and cool was born. And that's a story for a later program. Even after the Civil War, very few white people treated black language with any interest or respect. One who did was a man who'd grown up on the Mississippi and was fascinated by all of its talk, black and white. Luckily for us, he was a genius. When he made writing his profession, he chose as his pen name a call that he'd heard the riverboatmen use to sound a depth of 2 fathoms, Mark Twain. And the river runs through Twain's greatest book, The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. It's set in the years before the Civil War, and it's the story of a young boy who escapes what he disdainfully calls the civilizing influence of his Aunt Sally. Huck takes to the river on a raft in the company of an escaped slave called Jim. In his introduction, Twain told his readers that he'd taken great pains to capture the different dialects of the river. A southerner talks music, he once wrote, and when he'd Huck Finn describe life on the river, he found its melody.
It's lovely to live on a raft. We had the sky up there all speckled with stars, and we used to lay on our backs and look up at them and discuss about whether they was made or only just happened. Jim allowed that they was made, but I allowed that they happened. I judged it would have took too long to make so many. Jim said the moon could have laid 'em. Well, that looked kind of reasonable, so I didn't say nothing against it, because I seen a frog lay most as many. We used to watch the stars that fell, too, see 'em streak down. Jim allowed that they got spoiled and was hove out of the nest.
This is a new voice in the American record, that of the common man and the frontier. English has come a long way from the sober and sacred language that the Puritans had first brought to New England. It has changed its sound, and it has changed its character. Words were no longer solely vehicles for God's truth. There were also words that offended. The East Coast wasn't yet ready to relinquish its self-appointed role as guardian of the language. Back here at Concord, the cradle of the Revolution, the civilized Aunt Sallies who sat on the Library Committee banned Huckleberry Finn for its vernacular language. It was, they said, couched in a rough, ignorant dialect, and that there was a systematic use of bad grammar and an employment of inelegant expressions. But though the Library Committee might call Twain's language vulgar, it couldn't ban the vigor of English that had grown up away from the East Coast, American English. Huck's closing words defied their attempt to control it.
There ain't nothing more to write about, and I am rotten glad of it, because if I'd have known what a trouble it was to make a book, I wouldn't have tackled it and ain't a-going to no more. But I reckon I got a light out for the territory ahead of the rest, 'cause Aunt Sally, she's gonna adopt me and civilize me, and I can't stand it. I've been there before.
And the vigor continued to increase in the late 19th century. New waves of immigrants flooded into America. Germans, Italians, Greeks, Russians, Jews, from all across Europe they came to a land that promised to give a new home to the tired, poor, huddled masses, longing to breathe free. To become American was their dream, and for almost all of them, that meant that they wanted their children to speak the language of the new country. They would power the adventure of English into the 20th century.
The Adventures of English is available as a DVD, audiobook and book at Dymocks and a DVD at JB Hi-Fi.